Okay, I think everyone's trickled in from the waiting room. So, hello everyone, welcome again to one of our Funk Biogeography seminar series. This month we have Dr. Damaris Zurell from the University of Potsdam, but I have just a couple of things to talk about first. So, first off, if you haven't seen it yet, our first edition of the newsletter is now out. That should have been in your inbox, but if you haven't seen it and you would like to, or you'd like to subscribe to future editions, you can go to biogeography.org and click on newsletter in the header tab and find all the information there. And when we get close to the next edition, I'll start sending out some solicitations for advertisements for some things that you might want to advertise to the community as a whole. So keep an eye out for that if you have something like a PhD position or professorship at your university that you would like everyone to know about. As usual, this is how the structure works. This is going to be some general comments can go into the chat box. General comments can go in the chat box. I believe this was disabled previously and should actually work now, so you can now talk to everyone, which is great. And if you have questions you want to submit to our speaker, we will have you put that in the Q&A box typically. We will read that out on your behalf to the speaker to make sure that everything comes through. Next month, looking ahead, our speaker is going to be Dr. Michael Landis from the Washington University in St. Louis. That'll be May 27th, and the time will be 4 p.m. UTC. So there'll be more information on the details coming up pretty soon. And as always, thank you so much for attending. This will be eventually on our YouTube channel at International Biogeography if you'd like to view this again in the future or if you weren't able to be here today. If you aren't a member already and you would like to, you can go to biogeography.org. Consider doing that to help support us and the projects that we put on like this one. And if you're also interested in more open access biography, then check out our journal Frontiers of Biogeography at biogeography.pensoft.net. Lots of very cool articles that come out there. And with that, I will pass it to Marta to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Hikaru. Welcome, everyone. I'm Marta. I'm the Director for Public Affairs and Communications at the International Biogeography Society. You've seen me before. And as always, thank you all for joining us for April Funk Seminar. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Damaris Zurell as today's speaker. Dr. Zurell is a professor of ecology and macroecology at the University of Potsdam in Germany. She received her master's in geoecology from Institute of Geoecology at University of Potsdam, and her PhD also in geoecology, also from University of Potsdam. Before coming home to Potsdam to become a professor, she held a number of postdoctoral and research leader positions, including at the Swiss Federal Research Institute and Humboldt University in Berlin. Dr. Zurell's research focuses on understanding how species and communities respond to environmental change across spatial and temporal scales, excuse me, from individual movement and population dynamics to regional and global distribution patterns. She has worked across different taxa, including birds, plants, and mammals, and in a range of ecological systems and regions. Her research group develops and applies a broad range of biodiversity models, from correlative and statistical approaches to mechanistic and individual-based models. To improve predictability and support conservation decision-making, models that Dr. Zurell and her team develop often combine ecological processes such as dispersal and demography with large-scale biodiversity and environmental data. We are very excited to have Dr. Zurell with us today. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Zurell. And Damaris, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Marta. Thanks, Hikaru and Marta, for the introduction and for welcoming me here so warmly. So I'm going to talk about predicting biodiversity change in the Anthropocene today. I slightly provocatively, I called it forecasting like a climate scientist. That is just meant as a metaphor, basically, because the climate scientists have done so well in really predicting what the future could hold and bringing that into the policy process. I am aware that forecasting actually is a term that is quite ambiguous, so we can dispute whether that means just short-term or long-term forecasting whatsoever. I will not go into such debates today, right? So let's just say I use forecasting as a very rough term for saying we want to make predictions or projections into the future. So we all know biodiversity is our life support system. It is super vital for different things. It's embedded in the complex Earth system. It is important for our water and food supply, for our safety, for our health, and in the end also for the stability of the climate. Nevertheless, it is declining. Biodiversity and ecosystems are in peril. We've seen global trends and direct and indirect drivers that have accelerated extremely in the Anthropocene and that have also caused severe declines in our natural ecosystems and biodiversity. So this is just a very rough summary that had been put together in the IPBES Global Assessment Report, where we've seen, for example, that 47% of natural ecosystems have declined, 25% of the species that we recognize are currently threatened by extinction, 23% of biotic integrity, so natural communities or the state of the communities has declined. And also we've seen that 82% of wild mammal biomass has declined, while the amount of biomass in livestock has increased tremendously. And we also see that, for example, the population sizes of vertebrate species have declined by 73%. And when we look beyond the quantitative measures and look, for example, into the indicators by indigenous peoples, then also 72 of those indicators indicate that nature is in decline. So that is what has happened in the past, what we can already measure. We should not forget that at the same time, biodiversity is also redistributing in response to climate change, and that climate change is also accelerating. So species are on the move, and that could result in novel biotic communities in the future, and because of that also in rapid changes in ecosystem functioning, the outcome of which we don't clearly know. It could be negative. It will certainly not always be negative. There are also always positive effects. So we will have losers and winners when it comes to the species and also when it comes to certain ecosystem functions. Nevertheless, we see that on average biodiversity is declining, and that has happened despite repeated policy interventions. We've now agreed on the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework in 2022 that actually does set out an ambitious plan to halt biodiversity loss. We've defined 4 goals that should be achieved by 2050 and 23 action targets that should be achieved by 2030. I don't want to go through them in detail. What we want to achieve with that framework is really a transformative change. And the actions, they include, for example, that very charismatic target of conserving 30 by 30, conserving 30% of the land surface and the sea surface, but also restoring 30% of the degraded ecosystems. We also want to halt extinction and restore genetic diversity. So you already see that action is a bit more vague. It's not as clear-cut as saying we're conserving, we're protecting 30% of the land or sea surface. We want to reduce invasions by 50%. And all of those targets should also help to minimize climate change impacts. And beyond that, we are also caring about social aspect. We want to reduce inequities, improve capacity building, and also technical innovations that will help us to get on plan to meeting those global biodiversity goals and targets. An important question that we can ask ourselves is, are we actually able to deliver on that ambition? And to be more precise, we can expand that question and ask, do we actually understand enough about the risks that we are facing, that biodiversity ecosystem are facing, and do we understand enough about the trade-offs that might also exist between the different targets? As a global change ecologist, I have to say probably no. Because as currently designed, the biodiversity policy and also the GBF is actually at risk to missing the road to recovery. We tried to illustrate this here with this small cartoon or graphic, and what we currently do with the GBF is basically that we're sitting in a bus. The bus is driving forward, but we're only looking backward. We have our view in we just look at the rear view mirror by looking at indicators that we derive from monitoring data. So that tells us something about whether we have achieved targets. It produces accountability because we can say who are the players who have achieved something and who haven't, but it will not help us to really redirect our actions towards the road of recovery. This is where models come in. If we really want to move beyond the retrospect, then we actually need models that tell us something about the future. And models have also been used to inform the GBF, right? So this is a graphic that has been designed for the methodological assessment report by IPBES in 2016. And here we see where or how models could be used for policy and agenda setting. So at the moment, or what a monitoring framework does is this retrospective policy evaluation, that we are at a certain time point and we can look back. Have we actually achieved a certain target or not? How far away are we from achieving that target? And we can also use models for running exploratory scenarios for agenda setting. And this is actually where models have been used for the GBF, right? We have global models of biodiversity and ecosystem services. We have that in terrestrial as well as a marine realm. We have that Bending the Curve initiative that have used global models to assess what are potential futures and what happens if we increase conservation areas, or what happens if we additionally or alternatively change our consumptive behavior. And these kind of predictions or projections that those models provided have helped to shape the goals of the GBF. Where we are missing models is here in the intervention scenarios. So intervention scenarios could be split into target seeking or policy screening. In the target seeking, we want to achieve a certain target and we say what's the best path of actions to achieve that. And in the policy screening, we could compare what would be the outcomes for two or more alternative policy options. And this is where models remain underused. Underused to inform interventions on the ground. A particular problem or challenge we have in ecology as well is that ecology is of course scale dependent, and we have on the one hand the global agenda setting, but the implementations has to happen on the ground. Conservation is something inherently local. Conservation laws are at the national or even subnational scale. So we need models that are able to also inform local decision making. So ideally, we would have models that really inform the whole pathway from monitoring to mitigation. And I will show you a few examples of how models could do that in the course of this presentation. So how models can inform monitoring, how we can use models to better understand the different drivers, to detect and attribute biodiversity change to those different drivers, use models to improve scenarios and forecasts that are ultimately giving us all the information we need to do proper informed decision making. For the monitoring, we can ask where, how, and when should we monitor with detection and attribution. That's about what are the causes of biodiversity change. Scenarios and forecasts tell us what could the future hold. And decision making is really about what costs and trade-off exist. Additionally, what is often a bit overlooked but is gaining momentum at the moment is really the intersectoral feedback. So in the past, we've often regarded basically biodiversity as the endpoint of scenarios, the endpoint where we're predicting what happens to biodiversity under different assumptions of climate change, land use change, etc. But we are more and more recognizing that biodiversity is really an important part of the Anthropocene and can, of course, also feed back to land use and even to climate. And increasingly, we should also consider that in our predictions. But let me give you some examples. So first of all, let's look at how can models help guiding monitoring for trend detection. This is an example by my collaborator Darren Southwell from Australia, who used actually very simple models to optimize spatial and temporal monitoring. And we're currently trying to implement something similar for Germany. So there the question is, where and when is monitoring needed to correctly detect positive or negative biodiversity trends, right? So, I mean, we are doing the monitoring framework, we are implementing monitoring worldwide now, and we want to be able to say with statistical certainty whether a trend is positive or negative. And that's the question here. So what Darren did was that we he used real species, but then in the end imposed simulated occupancy trends for different species. And he simulated increasing occupancy trends and decreasing occupancy trends. He also simulated the distribution of different species to identify where we would have potential target locations for monitoring. Then he optimized the monitoring design itself. So that's the question of what is a good compromise between the number of sites we want to monitor, the survey frequency, how often do we want to monitor? Is that every year? Is that every second or every fifth year, etc.? And also, do we need within-year replicates, so multiple replicates per year in order to reduce, for example, detection bias? And then he fed all that into a power analysis, so to assess the statistical power to statistically detect a trend if it is truly there. Right? If there is a increasing or decreasing trend, do we have enough statistical power to detect that? As I said, he did that for different species in Australia. So here you see the different species. We had non-native species like cats and fox and cattle and rabbit. We had widespread species. These are the black ones like the emu or dingo, and rare species like the mulgaro or the dusky hopping mouse. And then he analyzed, in this plot we see for how many 2-hectare plots do we need for monitoring in order to properly detect the trends. And here we see the results for the different species, for a 30% decrease in occupancy, for a 50% decrease, or 30 or 50% increase in occupancy. And on the y-axis, you see the statistical power. Anything beyond 0.8 is good, right? Statisticians would typically say we want to have 80% statistical power. And I try to show that here with a shaded area. So whenever we are beyond that shaded area, that is something good. So you automatically see, hopefully, that here where we have a decrease in occupancy, we see way more lines for the different species that intersect with that shaded area, whereas down here for the increasing occupancy trends, we see fewer species intersecting with that shaded area, which tells us that positive occupancy trends are actually more easily detected than negative trends. What we also saw in the results, for example, is that repeat surveys considerably improve power. Of course, we have also differences from these trends. For example, we have the dingo here. We see that the statistical power only slowly increases for the dingo for detecting increasing trends. when we increase the number of plots. And that has to do with how rare or frequent the species is. The dingo is very common in Australia, so for very common species, it does make sense that it's also quite difficult to detect increasing trends. So these are good and bad news, right? For invasive species, it's probably good that we can easily detect positive occupancy trends. For species under conservation concern, it's quite worrying, concerning that we have a lower statistical power at detecting negative trends, because it could mean that in the end because we statistically detect a positive trend, we might stop conservation measures, and we don't start conservation measures early enough because it is more difficult to detect those negative trends. But this is where models can help to ensure that we have like a proper monitoring design, and maybe also as an implication to think about what would be good significance levels to judge increasing or decreasing trends. Models can, above that, also help to guide indicator development or application. And here I want to show you an example from a PhD candidate in our group by Raya Coit, who has been working on the red listing. So red listing, you probably know that, right? That we classify species into different categories of extinction threat, from least concern to critically endangered, or in the worst case, extinct or extinct in the wild. This classification is actually also used for the Red List Index that ranges between 0 and 1 and is one of the headline indicators in the GBF. And the Red List criteria can also be used to inform warning time, or to classify species under risk of future climate impacts. And for that, we can use models, and there are different ways of how we can apply the criteria for the red listing. We have criteria that are based on predictions of habitat loss. We have criteria that are based on predictions of abundance decreases, or criteria that are based on quantitatively estimating extinction probabilities from our models. And now Raya asked in her work, do the habitat-based or population-based modeling approaches actually provide the same warning time or enough warning time under climate change? And we approached that using simulated data. She had a complex individual-based model where she simulated 4 different virtual species, range dynamics. We had species that would contract their range under climate change, and we would have species that are shifting their range under climate change before going extinct. We had species with wide dispersal, short dispersal, species with high growth rate, low growth rate, and so on. And these are the results. So I know at first sight that's a complex figure. What we see here is that for the different red list categories, vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered, when have the different models, either models based on habitat suitability, model predictions based on population size, or model predictions about extinction probability, when have those model predictions prompted us to classify a species into a certain threat category? In gray, you see here when the species actually went extinct. That's a large gray line because we are there lumping together, pooling together a lot of different species. And so the difference between the box plots and the thick gray line is basically the warning time we have. When do our models warn that the species might be threatened by extinction, which is when we would be prompted to implement conservation actions, and how much time do we have left to really reduce the risk of extinction. So the more warning time, the better, you could say. And I also have to say that I won't explain it in detail, but the way we designed those analyses, we would assume the truth are our yellow boxes, or closest to the optimum of what we could achieve are those predictions based on population size, the lowest boxes. And we see that for classifying vulnerable species, all approaches are producing similar warning times. For classifying species as endangered or critically endangered, we do see some differences, but overall, for range contracting species, it still looks okay. At least habitat suitability predictions and population predictions produce very similar warning times. With extinction probability, it's a bit more complicated. So there it would really be worth thinking about changing those criteria in the red list. However, when we look at range shifting species, so those species also go extinct eventually, but they first undergo a range shift towards cooler climates. And there we see that the differences between the different assessments increases quite a bit. So suddenly the habitat suitability based assessments, they have a much later classification time, so smaller warning time than those predictions based on population size. And this increases as we go higher in the threat category to endangered or critically endangered species. So that means that habitat-based modeling approaches actually underestimate extinction risk for range-shifting species. And that is quite concerning because those indicators are also what has been used, for example, in the latest IPCC report when they reported on potential impacts of climate change. So those numbers we see might actually be even underestimating what could truly happen. It also tells us that the red list guidelines are not future-proof. So they're doing really great at range contracting species, which is more or less what they have been designed for. But for range shifting species under climate change, we may want to think about how can we revise those criteria. Models could also be used to quantify drivers of change. Here is a study by another PhD candidate, Katrin Schifferle, who studied bird occupancy dynamics in the US using the brilliant BBS data, breeding bird survey, that has been going on since the 1960s and is an annual monitoring frame. We only looked at species, at 159 species that have more or less a continuous reporting of their status since the 1990s. And we use that shorter time period because in the earlier time periods, there were less routes that have been continuously monitored. And what we're interested in is to see how have the occupied sites developed. We are fitting dynamic occupancy models to make predictions about these changes in occupancy. And then we are using the models to make predictions under counterfactual scenarios. So that relates both to land use and climate drivers, that we're basically detrending the observed climate trajectory or detrending the observed land use trajectory. For the land use, that simply means we keep land use constant at 1995. For the climate, it means that we keep the natural variability but take out the trend. And then we are also making predictions of what would have happened to those species, to the occupancy dynamics, if we didn't have climate change or if we didn't have land use change. And that allows us to, on the one hand, assess what is the relative impact of the different drivers, land use versus climate, but we can also then categorize the species into who was an absolute winner of global change, who was a relative winner. Meaning relative winner would be a species that still fared better under observed climate or land use change than it would have without that climate trend or without that land use trend, but the overall trend might still be negative. Or vice versa, we can also classify species into relative losers and absolute losers. So these are the occupancy trends that we found. The observed trends look like that, that for For the species that had fair predictive accuracy, these were from the 159 species, only 80 species for which we dared making those analyses. And of those 80 species, 31 actually showed a positive trend in occupancy, and 45 species showed a negative trend. Now let's look at how the trends would look like under counterfactual climate. So what are the trends we would have expected if there wasn't any climate change? And then we can look at how many of those species are actually absolute winners or relative winners. These are not too many, right? That's 17 species out of 80, whereas most of the species were absolute losers or relative losers of climate change. So there were definitely more global change losers than winners, although some species also profited from climate change. When we look at land use change, we see most of it is blue. So most species except 3 species that were either relative winners or didn't show any strong effect at all. The majority of the other species were absolute losers or relative losers from land use change. And we can also look at the relative magnitude of that effect, and we see that the relative importance of climate change was actually much stronger than the relative importance of land use change. So we can say over the past 30 years, climate change was way more important in driving bird occupancy dynamics in the US than land use change. And we see here that the climate and land use change together, the pattern actually looks very similar to climate change, which tells us that most of the land use, climate and land use impacts were rather antagonistic and not synergistic. So that was just over the past 30 years. We can also look further back what happened over the past 100 or 120 years since before the industrialization. And there we actually, Katrin is still analyzing it, but it looks like land use impact was made more important when we look further back into the last century, and that there was like a switch of driver relevance somewhere in the 60s and 70s. But that's very, very preliminary results. We can also use a similar approach of detection and attribution to then study intersectoral impacts. So here's an example by Leen Holle, another PhD candidate who works on zoonotic disease spread and wants to study historic and future hotspots of vector-borne diseases in Europe. So that's an example for tick-borne encephalitis here in Europe that is, as the name implies, transmitted by ticks. And we built comparably simple species distribution models, and the distribution of ticks would be determined by both climate and land use, whereas the distribution of the disease would be determined by the occurrence of the vector species of the ticks plus additionally climate. And then we again used factual predictions and counterfactual land use and climate change scenarios to study how the phenology of those of the ticks, of the vectors and the disease have changed over time, and also the relative occurrence probability. So the solid lines here indicate the actual prediction over the different decades. So currently we're here in the 2010s, the green line, and here on the left-hand side you also only see the historic phenology from the 1970s to the 2010s. And we see that under current climate, we have, for example, two peaks of high occurrence probability over the year and a small dip in summer for the vector species, and that bimodal phenology is even more pronounced for the disease. When we now look at the different counterfactuals, then we see, for example, if we switch off land use, then we are here at those lower dashed lines. So that tells us that the historic changes in overall prevalence, they were linked to land use change. When we look at the dotted lines or dotted dashed lines where we switched off climate, we see additionally that suddenly this summer dip actually vanishes. So that means that the changes in phenology there most strongly linked to climate change. And then we can also look at that, what happens in the future, and there we see that this bimodal phenology will be even more pronounced in the future as we have, for example, warming in Europe. And from those predictions, we can, of course, also then compute different aspects. Where do we find hotspots of high suitability in Europe? Where do we find increases in the duration of transmission periods? And we see, for example, here, where we have a lot of red throughout, that the transmission periods are actually increasing in a lot of places of Europe by on average 7.5 days per decade. Okay, so much for examples of what could happen under the future. And how could we classify also or like attribute to different drivers when it comes to past changes? I now want to spend a few more minutes to say something about trade-offs between targets. So I said initially we have those GBF targets of protecting 30% of sea surface or land surface, but we also have the target of decreasing extinction risk. We don't actually know whether those targets would complement each other. That if we do reduce or if we do protect 30% of the land surface, will we actually achieve a decrease in extinction risk by 50%? The other target is also that we, or part of the target 4 is not only extinction risk, but we also want to increase genetic variability in our species. So here's an example of the recovery of European bison populations. That is actually like a bigger endeavor together with colleagues from the Humboldt University, Hendrik Blum, who has been working on individual-based, spatially explicit population models of the bison, of the Central European bison populations. Tim Westermann, who is PhD candidate in my group, has continued working with that model, expanded it to a sexually explicit model and including genetic information, neutral genetics, which allow us to say something not only about the population size of those different populations in Central Europe, but also tell us something about the genetic connectivity. How much genetic exchange do we actually have between those different populations? And is that exchange enough to preserve or to achieve high adaptive potential into the future? So these are also very preliminary results. What we find is then that the populations could actually fare quite well in the future. So from today until 200 years into the future, we see that from the currently roughly 3,000 individuals that we have in the wild in Central Europe, we can expect that the population sizes will actually double over the next 100 to 200 years. So we clearly see that we have a population recovery. However, that does not go hand in hand with genetic connectivity or genetic diversity. So here we see the relative change in genetic connectivity under our baseline model, or if we include more wildlife corridors between existing populations, or when we actively translocate individuals between populations to actively reinforce populations that are otherwise impoverished in terms of genetic diversity. And we see that we will only achieve like an increase in genetic connectivity between the populations if we keep actively translocating. So that means although the local populations will actually fare quite well, the fragmentation of the landscape is so severe that it will be quite difficult to really have like a natural meta-population that will exchange freely. And that will not only impact the genetic connectivity between the populations, but it could also impact the allelic diversity, the genetic diversity within populations. So here we see how the allelic diversity within populations will develop over time relative to the current year. And again, that's showing the same scenarios. We have the base model where we don't actively manage. We have more wildlife corridors, and we have a scenario where we are actively translocating individuals, several individuals per year, actually. And we have 10 different wild populations at the moment, and we see that for most of those populations, we actually predict that allelic diversity will decrease over time, or at least slightly decrease, and that only under strong management like translocation we would achieve that allelic diversity would increase in the future. So that's also just a very preliminary example, but it does tell us that there are trade-offs between the different targets, right? So just because we achieve one target, increasing population size or reducing extinction risk of a certain species, that does not mean that we are necessarily achieving also the other targets of increasing genetic diversity. Lastly, I want to emphasize that, of course, it will also be important to look at feedbacks between biodiversity and other drivers, for example, land use drivers that are, of course, influenced by human decision making. So that's just a toy model that we published in a prospective paper that was led by Mark Urban a couple of years ago. And that couples two different models. The range shifter model, that is our spatially explicit individual-based population model that was also used for the bison study, and Crafty is an agent-based land use model that really takes into account the different capitals that you could make from different land users, considers farmers' decision-making given the value of different commodities and the economic situation on the world market. And it does, for example, also consider the effect of pollination, at least in extensively used farmlands, extensively used cropland or pastures of livestock farming. And the way the pollination is in there at the moment is very simple, that as soon as you have extensive farming, there will be a certain amount of habitat for the pollinator. Now we used range shifter to couple those two models and predicted how the pollinators might fare under climate change. And then it becomes actually quite interesting that the land use decisions will differ depending on whether we consider those coupled dynamics or not. So here in the coupled models, what happens is that because the pollinators decrease, that will under climate change, that will also affect the yields that could be harvested from the croplands. And that would mean that actually more habitat or more pasture or forest habitat is being converted to cropland to keep the same level of yield. So clearly, whether we consider or not what will be the effect on biodiversity in the future, that would affect the decision making of farmers in that case. And we would hence want to consider that. Right, so I hope I could convince you that what we want to have is that we want to achieve predictive models to really support the global biodiversity framework in different ways. I'm sorry that this figure is not shown properly. So models could help us to link actions to outcome and really help us answering what if questions. They could help us accounting for economic and societal costs. They could support adaptive management and monitoring. So just optimizing that once might not be enough. We may want to adapt both our models and decision making iteratively as we gather new data. Models can help us to anticipate lag times and to factor in those lag times, like we've seen for the range shifting species, factor in those delayed dynamics in our indicators, like the red list indicators. Models could also help us to scale local to global actions. So what we are doing locally, will that actually get us on track to achieve our goals and targets at the global level? And in the end, we could also use the models to extrapolate to data poor regions. So for me, it's always a riddle. Why has it not been done? Why is biodiversity science lagging behind climate science by so much, right? Like we're at least 20 years behind when we look at different hallmarks of what has happened in climate science or biodiversity science. And also this whole causal analysis of the, for example, detection attribution of drivers is still in its infancy. And there are a number of problems in the current models or model applications that we see. One aspect is that most of the applications that we see are still biased towards static and correlative models, and for example, do not factor in those transient dynamics and delays or lag times. That often they're biased towards the species level, which prevents us to either say something about higher level ecosystem functioning or lower level within species diversity, but which both are important to achieve the GBF targets. And our applications are also highly biased towards terrestrial and marine and to few taxa. And there are not many predictions for aquatic species, for example. And many of those models that goes hand in hand with the static and correlative models omit key biological processes and feedbacks with environmental drivers. If you're interested to know more about that timeline, you could check out, for example, our recent review on biodiversity model intercomparisons, where we've shown a timeline like that. When are important things happening in climate and biodiversity science? And for example, the first IPCC report was published in 1990. The first global IPBES assessment report was only published almost 30 years later. Then the climate modelers have started with model intercomparisons already in the 1990s, whereas as biodiversity scientists, we've only started in the 2010s. And when we look at the number of models that we look at in the marine or terrestrial realm compared to the climate models, then we also see there's a big gap in what could be achieved. This is what we try to tackle in our EcoCode hub of GeoBon. So EcoCode is a modeling hub that is situated in GeoBon, the Group on Earth Observation Biodiversity Observation Network. I'm co-leading that with a couple of colleagues, and we really want to push those things. If you're interested, please join. Everybody can become a member of GeoBon, and we're always happy if people want to actively contribute to the different themes. And those themes, as I mentioned, are really like, how can we use models to support that monitoring to mitigation pathways? At the moment, we have different strategic working groups or trying to establish different strategic working groups that are investing time into developing like more flexible and adaptable biodiversity projection platforms. We want to promote those biodiversity model intercomparisons. We want to integrate models and formal detection attribution frameworks, support monitoring design and sampling optimization, and also improve intersectoral models to capture feedbacks. So much from my side. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Damaris. That was great. If you have any questions, please put them in Q&A. There's already one here, so I'm going to read it off for you, Damaris. This one is from Philippe Lasecki. Did the habitat suitability models for extinction risk identification also include any connectivity between original suitable sites and novel suitable sites? Meaning, did you consider if the shifted range is accessible for a species?
Yes and no. So it's not necessarily so what we did in that study, or maybe I show the results here. So we followed very strictly what is recommended by the IUCN, and they're not necessarily recommending to include connectivity models, but what we did, what is not necessarily shown here, but what we also did was like complementing the habitat suitability models with simple measures of dispersal capability. So at least that incorporated a little bit how far the species could come, but it's not a fully fledged connectivity or dispersal model. That would be reflected by those yellow boxes, right? That would really show what models that include both population dynamics and dispersal to accessible areas, what they could achieve. And yeah, there's a big range in between of what other like kind of hybrid models you could use to achieve that. So the best we could do is the population models. Like any more realistic connectivity models would probably get us somewhere in between the red and the yellow, hopefully.
Okay, well, thank you. I have a question actually about your first study, I think, on the simulations and how many sites you need to visit to be able to detect a trend that's statistically significant. Yes, this one. I'm wondering, you might have said that already, but there is a clear difference between for which species you can first detect a decreasing versus increasing trend, right? So it's not always the same species that you can detect a decreasing trend with, let's say, 50 samples, and also 50 samples for increasing trend. So why is that? Why is this variation among species in terms of like how likely you are to detect increasing versus decreasing trend? Are there some species characteristics that would help you, that you're seeing, right, that explain this variation, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't analyzed it systematically, right? So we've used a couple of different species that are representing different cases, like the relative frequency, like how rare are those species or how common are those species, and that already seems to be a strong determinant. Like, for example, the dingo, the black one, is just very, very common and very common species, and that makes sense. Like, I mean, if they're already occupying a lot of habitat, it is difficult to say, has the number of habitats where they occupy has it increased statistically or not? So definitely the range size or relative occupancy, I expect that this will be a strong determinant. Beyond that, it is difficult right now to extract more information because we haven't done like a systematic analysis of the of different traits, but rather used species that are relevant for those very dry desert ecosystems here.
Okay, great, thank you. A question from an anonymous attendee. Thank you for the talk. It was fascinating. 2 questions. One, what is the predictive ability of the models presented? Are they validated against empirical data? And 2, how did you remove the effect of anthropogenic warming in the counterfactual climate scenarios in the breeding bird survey study?
Yeah, I can answer both questions maybe using that breeding bird survey. So yes, we've validated all those different models. This is also why in that paper or on that slide, I initially said like we were analyzing 159 species. So this is what we set out to do, that Katrin was given for which species we had enough data. She was trying to fit the models for 159. In the end, when we look at that graph here, we only had 80 species in the end, for which we looked at the relative importance of the drivers. And that difference is exactly because we did like a proper evaluation of predictive accuracy. And we did that in different ways. We looked at, we used a block cross-validation, both a spatial and a temporal cross-validation, if you will. So spatial block cross-validation, meaning we actually left out really big areas of the US from our training data to then really force the model to extrapolate in space. And the temporal validation was that we actually cut out some of the time series, calibrated the models on a shorter time series, and then predicted to years that have been held out from the data. And we use different measures for evaluating. And that is actually the case for most of the models we work with. So also when we work with range shifter, with the spatially explicit individual-based models, we have applications with that where we're really trying to connect that to monitoring data, to fine-tune the parameters to be as close as possible as at the observations, and then properly qualify predictive accuracy. And the other question of how did we detrend that? So there are algorithms for doing that. There we really work together with the EasyMIP group, the Intersectoral Impact Model Intercomparison project, that is standardizing a lot of those methods that really takes the climate scenarios from CIMIP and then feeds that into different impact sectors. Biodiversity is actually just like a small part of it. We have the energy sector, fire sector, etc. And they have also worked on methods to properly detrend the climate. That's called the tricky algorithm here, where yeah, I mean, the simplest way I could say it is now like simply a time series analysis where you analyze what's the natural intervals in the time series, what are the trends in the time series, and then you're just taking out the trend while keeping the natural variability.
Thank you. Okay, next question is from TM van den Doer. A key step in formal attribution analysis of extreme weather events is verifying that climate models actually capture historical patterns in the weather event of interest. In biodiversity, typically we do not have truly independent data to be able to verify. For example, models are trained and tested on occurrence data. How meaningful is it then to make attribution statements? It seems to me such attribution is much weaker without the independent validation of models.
Yeah, as I said, we did our best to validate the models, and to, even if we don't have independent data, to use this block cross-validation to really force the models to extrapolate. The other thing is, of course, I mean, the models or the attribution is just as good as the assumptions behind the models and the assumptions behind the climate. I mean, I would even say, like, I would be more worried about the reconstruction of the land use over the last 100 years than only the climate. So, but these are the assumptions we have to work with, and it has to be clear and transparently communicated that given the model assumptions, both in the biodiversity model and the other driver models, this is what we can conclude.
Mm-hmm. We have time for just one more question. From Toby Pennington, is your conclusion that biodiversity modeling is lagging behind climate science really fair? In that climate is so much easier to measure than biodiversity. For many groups, we don't even have a global inventory of species. Taxonomy is highly incomplete, even in higher plants that drive ecosystem function. We have no idea of genetic diversity in most described species. So is the issue not tied up with lack of data, especially in the tropics?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's not that we have invested a lot into the model or that we have everything available and just didn't manage to invest into the models, but the problem is more complicated. Of course, we have so many different ecosystems, so many different species on Earth that make the whole understanding more complex, and then a big issue are, of course, the monitoring data. Climate science, they've just started way earlier to collect standardized climate data. It's also way easier when you look at the list of essential climate variables. That's much smaller than the list of essential biodiversity variables or ecosystem variables to collect. So in that sense, it's maybe not entirely fair, but it's also important to say we are lagging behind because we are lagging also the funding, right? Like, I mean, there has been so much money being put into weather forecasts and climate science. If we would receive just the same kind of money, then we could make already a big step change.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Damaris. We are out of time and we need to let Dr. Zurell go for her next meeting. So thank you, Damaris, for joining us, for making the time to present your excellent research to our community. And everyone, thank you so much for joining. Please come again next month for a seminar from Mike and Landes. Till next time. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.